In the isolated town of Black Hollow, there lived a woman named Madame Irena, a master dollmaker known for creating exquisite, lifelike dolls. These dolls were not just decorations. They were believed to possess protective powers. Families would place the dolls by windows to ward off evil. However, strange things began happening after Irena mysteriously vanished one winter night, leaving behind her last, unfinished doll. Not long after her disappearance, children in the town began behaving oddly. They whispered to their dolls, speaking in voices far too mature for their age. Parents dismissed it as imaginary play until children began going missing. Each missing child was last seen holding one of Irena's dolls. A local school teacher named Elena grew suspicious and decided to investigate. She found Irena's old workshop, where shelves were lined with dozens of unblinking dolls. As Elena explored the workshop, she discovered Irena's journals hidden beneath the floorboards. The entries revealed a dark secret. Irena had made a pact with an ancient spirit in exchange for the ability to create dolls that could harness human souls. To animate the dolls, however, the spirit demanded a steady supply of young, innocent souls. The teacher was horrified to learn that each doll contained a fragment of a child's soul, making it impossible to destroy them without endangering the children trapped inside. Determined to end the curse, Elena searched for the unfinished doll Irena had left behind. When she found it, she was shocked. It was an exact replica of herself. As Elena tried to destroy the doll, it began to move, whispering in her voice. The spirit had been waiting for her, knowing that she would come. In a desperate struggle, Elena realized the only way to free the children was to sacrifice herself. She whispered a final prayer as the doll's glass eyes locked onto hers. When the townspeople arrived the next day, they found the workshop empty, with all the dolls mysteriously vanished. Elena was never seen again. In 1952, the Linden Grove Asylum closed abruptly after an incident that was never disclosed to the public. For years, it stood abandoned, gaining a reputation for being haunted. Urban explorers, thrill seekers, and paranormal investigators flocked to its decaying halls in hopes of capturing evidence of the supernatural. Among these was a group of 4 friends, Brian, Lisa, Marcus, and Sarah, who were live streaming their exploration one stormy night. As they ventured deeper, they stumbled upon a locked wing, a part of the building that was not listed on any blueprints. Using a crowbar, they pried open the door, revealing dusty medical files and equipment left untouched for decades. The files hinted at shadow entities, manifestations born from trauma and despair, which the asylum staff had been secretly experimenting on. The more the patients were exposed to these shadows, the more they became like them, insubstantial but dangerous beings trapped between life and death. Strange occurrences began as soon as they entered the wing. Whispers echoed down empty hallways, objects moved on their own, and the light from their flashlights flickered erratically. Marcus claimed he saw someone standing at the end of the hall, but when the others turned to look, no one was there. As fear settled over the group, Sarah mentioned feeling a cold breath on her neck, but no one was close enough to have caused it. Panic escalated when Marcus vanished without a trace, leaving only his flashlight spinning on the floor. His voice could still be heard faintly, calling for help, but it echoed from every direction at once. Desperately, the remaining friends tried to retrace their steps, but found themselves walking in circles, as if the building itself were shifting and changing around them. Finally, they reached the entrance, only to find it bricked over. In the flickering light, shadowy figures began to emerge from the walls, their faces distorted in agony. Brian, clutching the old medical files, realized the truth. Marcus had become one of them, a shadow trapped in a liminal space. The only way to escape was to leave someone behind to take his place. In the live stream's final moments, the audience could hear Lisa scream and the camera falling to the ground, capturing a last glimpse of her shadow, elongating unnaturally. The screen cut to black. None of the friends were ever seen again, and the asylum remains sealed to this day. The house on Briarwood Lane had been empty for decades. It stood like a grim sentinel against time, its windows dark and lifeless, its exterior covered in a tangle of ivy that seemed almost sentient in its slow encroachment over the decaying wood. Nobody went near it, not since the night the Miller family vanished without a trace. The only sound that ever echoed from its empty halls was the rustling of wind through broken panes and something else, a faint murmur, a whisper. When Ethan moved to Briarwood Lane, he thought the stories were just that, stories. He'd come to escape his own ghosts, a failed marriage, a job that had sapped his spirit, and a gnawing emptiness that threatened to swallow him whole. The solitude of the old neighborhood seemed like a sanctuary. The house called to him. It was the very reason the rent was so cheap. The landlord had almost begged him to take it, and Ethan, feeling reckless and tired of living in the shadow of his own failures, had agreed. From the moment he stepped inside, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Dust motes swirled lazily in the weak afternoon sunlight that filtered through cracked curtains. The floorboards groaned under his weight, as if protesting his presence. But Ethan brushed off the unease. This was his chance for a fresh start, to finally write that novel he'd always talked about, but never began. It started with small things, missing items, doors that were open in the morning when he was certain he'd closed them the night before, and that ever-present feeling of being watched. But he dismissed these occurrences as symptoms of an overactive imagination. He was alone in an old house. Old houses creaked and groaned. It was nothing, but then he started hearing the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the hum of his laptop and the soft rustling of leaves outside. Ethan would pause, listening intently, but the sound would vanish as soon as he focused on it. He started wearing headphones to drown out the noises, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. One night, while staring blankly at the blank page of his manuscript, he heard it clearly, a voice, soft and pleading.
Help me.
Ethan froze. The whisper was coming from behind the wall in front of him. He slowly pulled off his headphones, heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst. "Who's there?" he called out, feeling foolish as soon as the words left his mouth. Silence. But then, after a few seconds, the whisper returned, more distinct this time.
Help us.
Ethan's breath hitched. Us. He stood up, knocking his chair over in his haste. The voice was clearer now, but muffled, as if it was coming from within the wall itself. He pressed his ear to the cool plaster, straining to hear.
We're trapped, can't get out.
The words chilled him to the bone. He stumbled back, his mind racing. Who was trapped? There shouldn't be anyone else in the house. Was it a recording? A prank? He'd heard of landlords doing strange things to tenants, but this beyond bizarre. Desperation clawed at his throat. He grabbed a hammer from his toolbox and, with trembling hands, began to chip away at the wall. The plaster crumbled easily, revealing rotted wood underneath. He worked feverishly, not stopping even when his hands began to bleed from splinters and rough edges. Finally, he broke through. Behind the wall was a narrow crawl space. The air that wafted out was rank, filled with the stench of decay. Ethan gagged, stepping back. But he had to know, had to see. He shone his flashlight into the darkness and nearly dropped it in shock. There, huddled in the shadows, were 3 figures. They were grotesque, barely human twisted forms with hollow eyes and mouths frozen in eternal scream. But they moved, ever so slightly, as if straining against some invisible force. One of them, a woman with matted hair and skin stretched tight over her bones, turned her head slowly toward him. Her eyes, milky and dead, locked onto his.
Help us!
Ethan staggered back, his mind reeling. They couldn't be real. They couldn't. His thoughts were shattered as he heard a loud crack behind him. He spun around just in time to see the wall he'd broken begin to seal itself up, the plaster and wood knitting together as if time were rewinding. Panic surged through him. He tried to escape, but his feet felt like they were mired in quicksand. The room seemed to warp and twist, the very walls closing in around him. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling his ears with 1,000 voices, all begging, pleading, screaming.
We're trapped. Join us.
Ethan's scream echoed through the house, but outside, there was no one to hear it. The house on Briarwood Lane stood silent and still, its windows dark and lifeless. The whispers faded back into the walls, merging with the house itself. Another resident, another soul, forever claimed, and the house waited, patient as ever, for its next victim.